to the Oral History of Criminology project. Today we're here in Kansas City, Missouri at the meeting of the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences in 2017. My name is Jeremy Carter, and I'm pleased to interview Dr. David L. Carter from Michigan State University about his life as a distinguished criminologist in the field of criminology and criminal justice. This is a unique experience for me, is not only being a faculty member and a scholar in criminology and criminal justice myself, but also being that David is my father. To begin, I'll provide a brief overview of David's illustrious career to date, and then we will get into getting some of his insights. Dr. Carter is presently the professor and director of the intelligence program at Michigan State University in the School of Criminal Justice, where he's also an affiliated faculty member with MSU's Institute for Public Policy and Social Research. He received his BS and MS degrees in criminal justice from the University of Central Missouri and his PhD from Sam Houston State University, also in criminal justice. He has many career highlights, of which we will touch on a few. He began his career here in Kansas City, Missouri as a police officer with the Kansas City Police Department, and then proceeded to his first academic appointment at the University of Texas in Rio Grande Valley. Starting in 1985, he went to Michigan State University School of Criminal Justice, where he has been since that date. He's published 5 books, numerous journal articles, professional reports, technical reports, papers, and served on a number of editorial boards for different peer-reviewed journals in our discipline. He's received numerous grants from funding sources such as the National Institute of Justice, Office of Naval Research, Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, and the Department of Homeland Security. He served on a number of council and advisory boards for the U.S. Department of Justice, including the Global Intelligence Working Group, the Fusion Center Working Group, the National Gang Center, Valor for Blue Assessment Team, and others. He's also on the advisory board for the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia, and he is also on the advisory board for the International Association of Law Enforcement Intelligence Analysts. He's provided a number of expertise and presentations and insights to Justice Department initiatives, including the Violence Reduction Network, the Smart Suite Initiative, Targeting Violent Crime Initiative, and the Harvard Executive Sessions. He was the team leader for a number of homicide investigations for the Bureau of Justice Assistance in New Orleans, Puerto Rico, and also was the team leader of a national homicide mapping project to examine homicide case clearances. Notably, he was also the team leader for a community-oriented policing services office projects on policing the new economy and an assessment of the police response to demonstrations in Ferguson, Missouri following the Michael Brown shooting. He has numerous honors and awards, of which I will just highlight a few. He holds an honorary doctorate of law from the University of Central Missouri. He received the university's Distinguished Alumni Award from Sam Houston State University, has been recognized as an outstanding alumni from the College of Criminal Justice at Sam Houston State, and was inducted into Michigan State University's School of Criminal Justice Wall of Fame. He's a recipient of the O.W. Wilson Award from the Police Section of the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, as well as the Outstanding Service Award from the same section. He's received the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences Academy Fellow Award and has an Academic Fellow Award from the Foundation of Defense for Democracies in Washington, D.C. And he has also received numerous outstanding mentorship and scholarship awards from MSU and the Police Executive Research Forum. And with that, we will turn it to David to gather some of his insights and backgrounds on his career as a criminologist. So to begin, can you give us a little bit about your life leading up to your academic pursuits?
Well, thank you, Jeremy. It's great having you here, asking me these questions and taking a look at you. You read those things pretty much as the way I wrote them, so thank you. Very good. I didn't start my career being a criminologist or a researcher. You know, I wanted to be a police officer. And ironically, we're at the Marriott Hotel in downtown Kansas City, and ironically, that when I got out of the academy, the first beat I was assigned to was right here. Was geographically where this hotel was. is, and who would have thought that a few years later I'd be back here doing this. So, but it's one of those things. I'd like to say I had this great career plan that I was going to do this and go on to graduate school. So I started graduate school mainly so your mother could go to school and drive down to the University of Central Missouri with her. So I thought, well, if I'm driving down with her, I might as well get my master's degree. So I got my master's degree, still working with the police department, and a department head at that time said, hey, there's an opening for a professor in South Texas. And right now, remembering this is in the 1970s, if you have experience in a master's degree, you can probably get that job. So why I thought, well, that sounds kind of interesting. And so I went home and I told my wife, Jeremy's mother, about this. Well, she grew up in South Texas, about 30 miles from where this university was, a long way from here. She goes, apply for it. Next thing I know, we're moving to South Texas, and I'm a professor, not knowing a whole lot about what I'm supposed to be professing at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley. So it was nice. We're close to South Padre Island, close to Mexico, enjoying life in South Texas, avoiding the winters, teaching compared to working in law enforcement. This was, quite frankly, a piece of cake. I didn't do really much writing or anything down there because that wasn't expected at the time. And then one day my department head said, hey, you've been here going on 3 years. Have you applied to doctoral programs yet? And I went, no, not really. And said, well, you've got to have a doctorate to get tenure. I thought, thinking to myself, nobody told me that. So I chose Sam Houston. Now you'd say, well, why would you, of all the universities would be looking around, would you choose Sam Houston? Well, they had a good reputation, but I also have to admit, I had a very pragmatic side with me. I'm living in South Texas. Wasn't sure about fellowships or anything, and I knew I could get in-state tuition. So that kind of guided my, so it's not like I had this great plan, but a pragmatic plan. So I got to Sam Houston, and I met some great mentors. Really great mentors. Rolando Del Carmen, probably amongst the top, who really started, got me involved in writing papers and in writing, really gave me insights on this, and to this day I hold Rolando as an important mentor. Larry Hoover, who was a professor, and still is at Sam Houston, who ironically was from Michigan State. His degrees are from Michigan State. Also provided me a great deal of guidance and friends and mentorship. Vic Strecker, again, another former Michigan State professor who was dean at the time down there, and many others, not to leave them out. But I really started understanding the academic role, and they gave me the opportunities to really start doing my research and publication, and guided me that way. Finished up my doctorate, went back to Edinburgh, Texas, to Lower Grand Valley, and said, well, it's time to move on. And so after a couple of years, of course, I had 3 young children then to also move around, who were somewhat pesky, I might add. But as I was looking around, I saw an opening at Michigan State. And I knew Bob Drajanowitz, the late Bob Drajanowitz, by reputation. Used his book, one of his books, in one of my classes. I knew the work that he was doing with the what was then called the National Neighborhood Foot Patrol Center, later became the National Community Policing Center, and actually been using some of his book with agencies I was working at in South Texas as they were trying to deal with a number of civil rights lawsuits. And so I applied to Michigan State. Never been there, and went up there and just really bonded well with Bob Drajanowitz and many of the faculty. And a short while later, I was appointed there, and been there ever since. So and really started building my research agenda really up there. I'd started it at SAM, but MSU gave me the opportunities to really push it forward.
Very good. So would you say, were there any biographical connections that you have that have translated into your current research agenda? Obviously, you mentioned your initial experience as a Kansas City police officer and how that perhaps shaped your interest in research, especially given you were a police officer here during the infamous preventive patrol study.
And that was actually one of them, the preventive patrol studies. Unique opportunities at that time that I had, people with working from the Police Foundation, riding with me some. I started talking to them. I was able to actually participate. There was people were familiar with the preventive patrol study here in Kansas City, but there were all kinds of different projects going on under the leadership of Clarence Kelly as the chief of police, who was very innovative, particularly for the time. And you got a different sense of what can you do in policing, and it's just kind of like the whole idea of research, the whole idea of looking at the world of policing differently, and I think that clearly had a key on some of the things of the way I viewed policing research. Also biographically, I guess if we just kind of looking at it, as I said, at my experience at Sam Houston, of working with, again, Rolando Del Carmen, Larry Hoover, those two, Vic Strecker, and looking at policing through, I think, a creative and a little bit different perspective. And one thing that stayed with me, Rolando Del Carmen, I assume many will know, is an extraordinary constitutional lawyer. Has written extensively, and he really cemented in me, I think, some of the ideas that I learned about constitutional limitations to policing, which I look at Vic Strecker and Larry Hoover and some of my other work in terms of I've always been able to do many things. I think you've seen this through the work we've done together on intelligence. I've really been able to keep that perspective of constitutional limitations with police policy in stride. I think that has actually guided me a great deal of my career going through in terms of a lot of the work I've done.
Okay.
I guess let me interrupt you, Jerry. I guess the other biographical thing I'll mention that just kind of jumps out was actually came out of my dissertation. I was living in South Texas, had been living in South Texas, which is an area called the Rio Grande Valley. Population at that time was about 80% Hispanic. Virtually all of my students were Mexican American, Hispanic. Most of them were first generation, and I really got an appreciation toward dealing with the challenges that many of the Hispanic students had in dealing with policing issues, etc. And I got to know many of them very, very, very well. And help them in their careers, I think, for some of them. So as a result of that, when I got time to do my dissertation, I got a grant to do a study on Hispanic attitudes toward crime and justice in Texas, which ironically, not only did I published out of it, but I mean, back in the 80s, I'm still getting a lot of cites and references to it today. So I think as a piece of long-lasting research in terms of dealing with something like that in the Hispanic community, which biographically, again, just happened to be where I was living and the new experiences. Let me tell you, a kid from the Midwest, growing up in Midwest and suddenly find myself living 20 miles north of the Mexican border in South Texas, it was a different experience. And one I absolutely loved. It was a great area. Plus, we like going South Padre Island. Yeah, can't forget that. So,
that discussion of your work with the Hispanic community transitions us nicely into a more general discussion of your body of work to date. What would you say is the major theme or themes to which your work evolves around?
I'd say the foundation theme is community policing, and I've got to give the credit to the late Bob Trujanowicz. When Bob, or Trojo as we always called him, was a hired man and had done a lot of his initial research on community policing through grants from the Mott Foundation, and a lot of work in Flint and other areas. And he really brought me in and started really working on community policing. There's no doubt. I mean, I started my first training, for example, the FBI National Academy. We did our research, our publications. I worked with them on NIJ grants. but really trying to look at community policing in terms of how it worked. Now, some people I don't think always saw this connection immediately, but I would say that there are really three highlights areas that I've really been working in: community policing, intelligence, law enforcement intelligence, and homicide investigations. Community policing permeates all three of those really extensively, and the value that being able to establish that community relationship for example, for the intelligence cycle, as we look at state and local law enforcement, and then again for homicide, we can talk about that a little bit later on. You certainly know what I'm talking about here, but they need to have that community support for effective homicide clearances. It all goes back to that foundation, community policing, and I think that's I kind of bounce back to that frequently in virtually all of my work in terms of the importance of being able to really reach out and establish those community relationships. I remember when I was a new officer here in Kansas City, you know, and during the kind of the professional era of policing, if you will, in terms of the way you approach it. But I can remember I acted as a sergeant. You got to get up there. You got to know the people. You got to know the people who you're talking. You don't deal with them just as a call. You deal with them as people, and I think that unknowingly at the time also helped build that foundation for community policing.
One of the things that you touch on intelligence and homicide, a lot of your work, especially of late in the last decade, let's say, I would say has occurred in very political environments. Mm-hmm. You've conducted field research in intense situations. Mm-hmm. That certainly garnered national attention. Can you talk a little bit about this idea of doing research in these type of environments?
But you probably because a lot of my research is very policy oriented. And why do I do policy oriented research versus theoretical research? Because I find it more interesting. You know, it's more interesting, and I can see something at the end of the day happen. The challenge with doing a lot of policy research is it does exist in a politicized environment. So one of the early ones was actually a local issue in Lansing, Michigan. We were helping the police department. The chief at the time, Mark Alley, who was ironically been one of my former students, was wanting to establish racial profiling data collection. And so because there was a lot of comments from the community, and so invited a colleague and I, as actually my doctoral student at the time, now the department head at SIU, Joe Schaefer. And so Joe and I went down to meet with Mark, the Chief Alley, and talk about how we're going to develop data collection for racial profiling analysis in Lansing, Michigan. Developed a plan. We developed data collection schemes. So he wanted to talk with the community. Community meetings, we started going to community meetings with Joe and I and another colleague, Andrew Bannister from Wichita State. Holy cow, the community just attacked us. How do we know you're not going to just find this stuff to make the findings for the police department? How do we know you're not going to cover it up? And so you find yourself trying to establish your integrity and credibility. When we met with the officers to explain what we were doing, well, they didn't trust us either. You're just here. You're out here. You're going to take care of and find out the community wants. So we had both the community and the officers. None of us trusting us. So which reinforces the need to be accurate in the way that you start developing your research and doing your analysis. And to this day, we look at that. Well, I didn't realize the foundation that was going to give me for politics in terms of other projects. I'll just give you two examples. New Orleans Police Department was having issues, particularly post-Katrina, with homicide investigations. As we know, the average homicide rate in the United States is about 4.5 homicides per 100,000. In New Orleans at the time, it was 22 homicides per 100,000. Average clearance rate in the United States, around 65%. New Orleans at that time, about 11%. So they had homicide low clearances, and so they'd asked the Bureau of Justice assistants to come in and try to help them increase their homicide clearance rates. And so I was named the team leader. I had a really good team of strong, experienced homicide investigators whom also had strong academic credentials. I had a good forensic science one. We developed a methodology for this to go in and basically say, now, so we've got political issues. We've got still post-Katrina investigations going on. This started in 2011, I think it was. But there was a civil rights investigation going on at the New Orleans Police Department at the time, a criminal civil rights investigation, and we're doing this assessment. So the night before we get there for our first interview session, the Mayor Landrieu asked us to come in, asked myself and the BJ project monitor to come in and talk to him about how we're going to do the project. So of course we did. So we're sitting in Mayor Landrieu's office, had this nice conversation. He reaches over the intercom. He says, "Okay, you can send them in." Well, the night before there'd been a shooting, a drive-by gang shooting, killing a small child as an innocent victim, and of course the community was really concerned. When he said come in, the community, a bunch of community members came in, including community leaders and activists and the clergy, followed by the media. They all came into Mayor Landrieu's office, and so Mike Medeiros, the BJ project monitor, and I are sitting there, and kind of stood up, and Mayor Landrieu turns to the group and said, "President Obama has sent these men to New Orleans to fix our homicide problem." And Mike Medeiros was thinking, "Oh crap," and I said it. So it's like, I don't know. And then the pressure was on us to really try to deal with this. So now we're going into, it's highly visible, a lot of news media. What are you going to do? Well, we don't know yet. I don't know yet. And we ended up, by the way, the mayor's office, with the mayor looking at me, and he said, before we leave and you start your project, would you lead us in a prayer? And fortunately, one of the clergy members there must have seen the deer in the headlight look I had and took over and led the prayer as we had the prayer circle in Mayor Landrieu's office. Now we go to the police department. 7 people from outside coming into the police department that's been under all kinds of inquiry, that's under civil rights investigation, and they see us come in, and we got to get them to talk to us. So we did. I mean, it took some work, but we were able to get that. We started developing their confidence. Challenges for those of you who read this, or watch this, you're doing research. Obviously, we know the importance of protection of human subjects, and I told my team ahead of time, while this is not pure research, it's assessment, we're going to follow those guidelines. And all of our interviews are going to be confidential. And we do. I say we don't write anybody's names down. We don't take business cards. We interview them. We'll give a numbering system so we can distinguish between interviews, but we can't go back and identify them. Now the challenge is they're under the New Orleans Police Department's under a federal civil rights investigation. We have the Civil Rights Division coming to us saying, I want your notes, I want your interviews, who did you interview? And I can just say, I don't know. Of which they weren't real happy about that. But we weren't investigating, we were doing assessing. And so you deal with these kind of challenges in the environment. The other one, not to belabor this, but I'll talk about Ferguson. I think everyone's familiar with the shooting of Michael Brown. There were 3, by Darren Wilson, there were 3 inquiries at the time. The first was a civil rights investigation, criminal civil rights investigation against Darren Wilson, of which, of course, the officer, there was no probable cause and there was no charges. The second was a civil rights investigation of the Ferguson Police Department, of which just a really harsh, critical report from the Civil Rights Division challenged them, and a consent decree was entered. The third was not an investigation, but it was an assessment of the police response in Ferguson, of looking at how 4 agencies, Ferguson Police Department, St. Louis County Police Department, St. Louis City Police Department, and Missouri State Highway Patrol responded because to the demonstrations, because it was very militarized. There was a lot of tear gas used, a lot of emotion that was involved. And so I was named team leader to lead this assessment. So again, I had a very good team. I had researchers. I had an attorney, a former chief of police in Sacramento, Rick Brazil, a very competent PhD police lieutenant from Dallas, Roy Alton. We had Ms. Gerald Williams, who was a attorney and a minister from Phoenix. We had this really well-rounded group, and then so we had to go in and start again agencies. We did over 160 interviews of officers, people of all ranks. We interviewed community members. We interviewed business leaders. We interviewed people of the faith community, and assessed all kinds of documents, the amount of video, etc. The politicized environment was the question. Now, that's why I go back to, and I'll be very candid about this, people were really mad in the Justice Department that they couldn't get a criminal charge against Darren Wilson. There was anger. That's one reason why the Civil Rights Division report against the Ferguson Police Department, I think, was so harshly written. And they wanted our report to have the same tone. And frankly, it didn't. It didn't on purpose. And as a group, we looked at this, and again, objective, I think, professional, and we had a great deal of pressure to write our report that was uber critical of these 4 departments. And frankly, they just didn't deserve it. Some of the decisions that they made were not popular. For example, in the use of tear gas, the way they used it, but it was justified. It followed policy. It has terrible visual elements to it when you see a picture, you see a video, but they followed policy and law. All right. We had community members who praised the use of this, particularly St. Louis County Police Department, for using tear gas, because they said that saved our property, saved our businesses. But you really didn't hear those in the media. So our battle was frankly with the Justice Department in terms of how we were going to word the report. And when you have, for example, a presidential appointee saying, "I want you to change this," what do? Well, you just remember that presidential appointee has a temporary job. You know, my job is tenured. So again, you look at some of these things, but it's interesting, but a challenge to do that work in a politicized environment.
Very good. Certainly those contributions have been fascinating, noteworthy, and have received a number of attention. But what works would you say before that would you look back on with great pride in terms of reflecting your contributions to practice and to scholarship?
I think there's some of the community policing, the Hispanic attitude stuff, although it was small, so it had a lasting influence. Probably one of the things, and people sometimes are curious about, is how in the world did I get involved in intelligence? Does that seem kind of like an odd thing? Well, I got involved in intelligence way before 9/11. Shortly after I'd come to Michigan State, we were contacted by Assistant Administrator of Drug Enforcement Administration, a guy named Dave Westrate. Dave happened to be a Michigan State graduate. And this was in the 80s, and DEA was actually a very small organization at the time, comparatively small, but they were facing this gigantic, unprecedented problem of drug trafficking from the Colombian cartels. They hadn't seen this before on this volume. The amounts of money, the global implications of the trafficking of it. They were becoming multi-hundred millionaires and billionaires. They were intermingling their drug profits with investments in legitimate businesses. They just hadn't seen anything like this before at DEA, and they were getting, so DEA said that they wanted to develop an intelligence division because they thought that's the way they would have to deal with this, because they had one, but it was really small. They really wanted it and so it came to us, and actually it came to Michigan State, came to Bob Trojanowicz and myself, and Trojo basically gave it to me to really work with DEA to see what they could do to try to help develop their analytic capabilities. And so working with them through understanding and really the learning in progress, the legal issues, the analytic issues, and putting it all together is actually where I started my work in intelligence with DEA. It was interesting to point this out between the national security intelligence and law enforcement intelligence. At this time, DEA was located in downtown Washington at 14th and K Street. They had these beautiful buildings out in Northern Virginia, down Alexandria now, or Arlington. But this was small buildings a small building downtown. And at that time, at 14th and K in downtown DC, it was really a bad area. You know, it wasn't that far from the Capitol and White House, but this was just a bad area. There's a park across the street. You could stand in DEA quarters and watch people doing drug deals in the park across the street. The closest place to eat was on the ground floor of DEA's headquarters, where there was a People's Drug Store and a strip bar that had a lunch buffet. So, you know, this is a real academic environment. So what they wanted to do was try to find an experienced intelligence analyst. So they said, well, what's the best way to do this? Let's steal them from the CIA. We'll offer them more money. We'll give them a career track that they don't have at CIA, and we'll let them work overseas. DEA's offices overseas. So one of the things I was asked to look at is how can we integrate these people in here? How can we put them in? So they brought all these new CIA intelligence analysts in to downtown DC to start working, and I mean they were working. You know, computers were clicking, printers were whirring, and they were putting out these intelligence reports that were pretty. You know, they were nicely done. Margins were nice. They had, you know, photographs and circles and arrows. They looked good. They had a lot of face validity. And when it got to them, but to the end of it says the reports would say something like, well, and therefore we think these cartels pose a threat to the United States national security interest. And DEA goes, we knew that. We want to put them in jail. And the intelligence analyst said, well, we don't know how to do that. That's not part of our job. So that led to how do you develop a curriculum of training, research, and education to train law enforcement intelligence analysts. I start offering classes on this and doing some different training programs on intelligence, so in the late 1980s, all right? And frankly, nobody cared. There wasn't a whole lot that cared. But it was kind of interesting, and it was more of a sideline, because I was still doing community policing and some other things. It was kind of like, but every time I offered the courses, it would just fill. I mean, it would absolutely fill. You know, 120 students. Students loved it. And then 9/11. And so when 9/11 came, all of a sudden, my intelligence was in demand. And then for the first time, we really tried to start working and looking at how we really developed the intelligence process. For those who watch this, Jeremy worked on a series of multi-billion-dollar grants that we had through Department of Homeland Security, where we did intelligence training throughout the country. And the neat thing is we developed our curriculum based upon rigor of science, what works, what doesn't, what's the law, and trained literally all 50 states and Puerto Rico on the intelligence process. And the value of that is that we literally had people coming in to our program saying, how do we do this, and developing their intelligence capacity. From that, we had what was it, 800 new NYPD, I think it was something like that, NYPD counterterrorism and intelligence training officers. So we go from NYPD to small communities. We even had to go to Maui. It's, you know, protecting the threat from the Pacific. And so when we look at this, we really made change. Now, as you well know, Jeremy, that one of the things that this did was this started creation not only our appearance and our foundation of intelligence as for training of technical assistants. People say, does this work? And that laid the foundation for us to get the NIJ grant, the National Institute of Justice grant, to do research on the effectiveness of intelligence and infusion centers. This helped build our academic program to where we now offer an online terminal master's degree designed around like an MBA, but for law enforcement intelligence analysis, and a certificate program in intelligence analysis at Michigan State, which is a very popular program. And so the idea is we have integrated everything. We've integrated teaching, research, and service into the intelligence program, and it's not only had a lasting effect in the agencies that we have trained, but it's helping people in their careers, and it's also giving us a research agenda for which you've published extensively as I have. But it's also interesting when I look at the students in my online classes. When I first started the online program, as if we did intelligence online because we had people from all over the country who were interested in this, and turns out all over the world. And when I have soldiers in Afghanistan saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, my posting was a little late because I was in a firefight," just every now and then you kind of bend the academic standard a little bit to accept it late. But I think that's had an impact. The other thing I think is in homicide, and the work with the homicide clearances is what we learned in Puerto Rico and in New Orleans and elsewhere, and developed the homicide process mapping. And again, you've been involved in this. Is we've seen changes in homicide clearances. One of my best illustrations is part of the violence reduction networks in Wilmington, Delaware, where the chief at the time, Bobby Cummings, they had about a 25% clearance rate. And we did training in there. We helped them develop their policies and practices. He implemented virtually everything that we asked and suggested. And the next year, the homicide clearances jumped up to almost 60%. And they continue to work. They work, and they're not expensive. So when you can see your work having an impact, to me, that's valuable.
You haven't really touched on these, but I think if you look at your careers and your body of work, I think it's important to point out that you've done some of the foundational work with regard to police education, mm-hmm. and with regard to moving beyond the United States and bringing in that comparative piece with international work. Can you talk a little bit about?
Sure. Police education. I had a friend, ironically, Daryl Stevens, who some people may know. Daryl is a former chief in Charlotte and Mecklenburg, as well as other places. He was he's currently the executive director of the Major City Chiefs Association. And but at the time when I was working with him, he was the executive director of the Police Executive Research Forum. Daryl was also a former sergeant here in the Kansas City Police Department. So we had our Kansas City bonds together, wearing our Royals hats and Chiefs jerseys. And so I started working with Daryl at the Police Executive Research Forum at PERF. And he was really interested, said, "What's the state of police education? Can you do a study on it?" So I, along with a late colleague, Al Sapp, at the University of Central Missouri, we started doing we did a national study on police education at the time, and really looked at what that, and ironically that has served to pass in terms of a great deal of work in terms of what is the role of education, how is education viewed in law enforcement agencies, and I've got to give kudos to Daryl and to PERF on guiding that. But we got a lot of publication out of it. But it also helped change foundations. One interesting thing, despite everything else we talk about in police education, how it helps in decision making, how it matures individuals, how it gives them a greater resource to make decisions. The single thing that police departments really at the time responded to, of what they liked about it, is that we're able to show that, through our research, we were able to show that if you have a higher education requirement for your officers, a college requirement for your officers, it reduced liability, insurance, and it reduced the number of civil rights lawsuits against an agency. So it's kind of like it came down to dollars and cents. Surprise. But that was it. The international stuff has been quite interesting. Probably a lot of us I did for about 15 years, as you well know, as director of our study abroad program in criminal justice at Michigan State. We were focused in England. I say for the listeners and viewers, he well knows because Jeremy took advantage of it twice.
And then, grad and undergrad.
Yeah, undergrad and undergrad, and then found he needed a little bit more extra study abroad, so he went to Australia. And so, but at any rate, he was taking to heart my belief in the importance of international education, and I do believe that. I did a lot of work with a lot of British constabularies, the former National Criminal Intelligence Service in the UK, London Met, Staffordshire Police, Thames Valley Police, among others. I've had the opportunity to do some work with the FBI and the International Law Enforcement Academy in Budapest. Did work with the Norwegian police. Seems like there's others in Thailand. I did a lot of work with the Royal Thai Police, community policing and computer crime, Hong Kong Police, Police Integrity Commission in Australia, the United Nations Asia Far East Institute in Japan, among others. And in each one of these places, basically what I was doing was the same thing I'd been doing elsewhere. We're looking at community policing, analysis, particularly looking at intelligence. I kind of got away from this when I was talking about intelligence, but the importance of analysis and bringing intelligence analysis or crime analysis together for effective decision making, all within the whole framework of evidence-based policing.
So as we know in our field, the process of research and the findings of research can result in criticism. Mm-hmm. Would you say that your career, your body of work, or certain pieces of your bodies of work have resulted in criticism? And if so, what you've done to navigate that?
I think criticism has come from, of course, if you don't challenge things, you're not going to get criticized. If everything is hunky-dory, you're not doing something right. But a lot of the criticism I've come from it has been, it has not been as much from the methods and the findings of the research. It's actually been more something we talked about earlier, political. I didn't get findings people wanted. What do you mean that this police department is not racially profiling us? Of course they are. I'll talk about this as one illustration. I had an African American man say, I was racially profiled by the Lansing Police Department. I said, well, how do you know that? He says, because I'm black and I was stopped for speeding and on 496 in Lansing. And I said, were you speeding? He goes, well, yeah. And I said, well, that's why you were stopped. But he was convinced he was racially profiled. Now my illustration of that is, if you have a finding that people disagree with, they're emotional. They're not rational, and we try to be rational in an emotional environment, and sometimes that just doesn't work. The findings in Ferguson were a great deal about that, and so I think some of it. I think some of the things that people go against their intuitive belief. When we say something that is not intuitive, if we have a finding, and this is true with any research, people will disregard it. Community policing is important for intelligence analysis. Why? What's that got to do with? People go, well, I don't get it. Well, it's because we have to get our raw information from somewhere for the intelligence cycle, and the best source of raw information comes from the community. And if the community doesn't trust you, they won't give you what you need. It's the same thing in a homicide investigation. But I think for anyone who recognizes doing research, when you have findings that are not consistent with intuition, there'll be criticism. And what you have to do is just go prove it. All right, I've got the evidence. I can show this. I can prove it. My recognition is if you don't get criticized by some, now there could be people who are out there who are critics, including referees of journal articles, just because they don't like your work. And of course, I did it with a colleague. I did an article a number of years ago on the future of computer crime, and one of the referees of the article said, "This is ridiculous. There's not going to be anything like this. This is the only thing we have to worry about with computers is child porn." Well, and we didn't get the article published. Ha! Whoever that is. Look at cyber issues now. So if I look, the research process in criminal justice is not perfect, as you and I have discussed this. But in terms of criticism, most of the criticism I've had has been in that vein.
And so, on these discussions of reflecting on your career, when you identify what we would say are your key attributes, your defining characteristics as a scholar, what traits would you identify as?
Very policy oriented. I like research. I use the research method, the scientific method. I'm a full believer in the scientific method, but it's on policy issues. That's what interests me. I like to see something done with my work. I'm not denigrating theoretical research at all. We need theoretical research, but everyone's got to find their own lane. And my lane is, when I do something, when I publish something, when I work with an agency, I can see a change. All right, I can see a change the way they do something, and I've seen it over and over. With they say, okay, based upon this, we're going to make a change in the way we do business, and so you've actually done something, with that research. It may not be theoretical, but it still follows the scientific method. That's what I think is the keystone, and that's what interests me, and actually doing the research, doing the data collection yourself. I think we get hung up sometimes in how many articles can you publish, and we all know that. I mean, and I sit on RPT committees and I review people in terms of going up for that. I understand they need to publish, but. And I understand a lot of people who do secondary analysis of data. But the problems with doing a secondary analysis of data, you really aren't collecting the data. You learn about your subject area by collecting the data, by doing the research, by getting out there, particularly talking to people, using qualitative methods. I know qualitative methods are not as in vogue as quantitative methods, but they're much more interesting and they give you a granular feel. And they're needed. They're needed in the researcher practitioner initiatives that are going on now with BJA, where they're really marrying together researchers with practitioners. The value of seeing how a researcher can help a practitioner, and how that researcher can also see the challenges that you don't find in the stat lab. So those are the kinds of things that I really like looking at.
So we've covered a lot of territory on what you've done over the last 30 plus years in this field. With these reflections in mind, are there things you would have done differently? Are there things that you would tell those watching? This is my advice for you up and coming scholars.
There's not a whole lot. We kind of talked about this before. I can't really think there's a whole lot I would do differently. Maybe having a little bit of insight, by stumbling around in my early years, that kind of falling, it shows that you don't have to have really a defined career path necessarily, that you can kind of, for a while, go through life, but you eventually got to kind of pull it all together. I think my decisions and mistakes have served me well. looking ahead, I think in terms of really having an agenda, finding something that you're interested in, and you don't have to lock yourself in, but really finding something that generates your interest, and think about doing the actual research on it, not just, as I mentioned a while ago, not just secondary analysis of data, but really going out and talking to people who are studying that problem, or you dealing with that problem, whatever it is that you're doing. Engage with agencies. It used to be hard to engage with agencies, to work with them. It's much easier now. And you go out there and go to an agency, and some people are uncomfortable with that, but you've got educated people who are leaders of these agencies, who understand, appreciate research, and really engage with them to say, okay, what can I do to help them, and that will help you in your career. Second, really trying to solve problems of looking ahead and viewing the criminal justice system very systemically. One of the things about intelligence analysis, and to a lesser extent, but that's also community policing, but they're very systemic in nature. And so what I mean by that is, if a community's got a problem with crime or homicides, they go, oh my God, police department, do something. But the police departments can only do a little bit. We really have to look at what are the systemic natures of the causes, the implications of this crime, what's contributing to it, what are other preventive methods that we can do to prevent this crime, to go back to the community policing stuff. So I mean, really looking kind of a broad systemic approach to your research problem, whatever that may be.
And so, I guess, what would you say, again, over this 30, give or take, years of being in the field and seeing where we are headed, how would you assess our current state of affairs, and not only the Academy of Criminal Justice and Criminology, but certainly as our intellectual efforts move forward?
I am very much a glass half full person. I'm very much an optimist. I can find something positive in just about any element. I think, again, the researcher practitioner initiatives by BJ in particular, I think, are very optimistic for both. I think that we are being much more contemplative in the field about what works, the evidence-based movement, clearly. Yeah, I think that looks at it. I think we're seeing more, because of these movements that we're seeing like that, we're seeing more interest. I think that's, in our doctoral students, I think there's more interest of, okay, let's really working at it, and let's really working with the field. Probably in academia that I don't like, that I'm less optimistic, and this is not criminal justice. I'm not so less about. I'm not sure if it's how well it serves us. Is the move to pure analytics, measuring the performance, the academic analytics. There, I said it. I'm not sure that serves us well, because I don't think it measures the things that in criminal justice that we are doing. Does it measure grants from Department of Justice or Department of Homeland Security? It doesn't necessarily measure all of the journals that are out there. I mean, how can you effectively have, which is ironic, how can you effectively have a measurement of variables when you don't measure all your variables? I think that in the academy, that is in academia, I'm not sure that's a good movement. I don't think that's measuring what we do effectively. But in our field, in our discipline, I think we're doing quite well.
So as we conclude our discussion, are there things that you would like to put on the record or discuss that we have not touched on?
That while research, publication, working with agencies, your teaching, while that's all important, remember to have fun. I mean, you got to have a life. This is part of life, and so take the good with the bad. One of the things that we have I always strive for when we did grants and projects is, well, let's have fun while we're doing it. And so, hey, the grants are over with now. So when we would do training grants, we'd go to Alaska during the summer and Hawaii during the winter. I mean, we would
Coincidentally.
We would take extra days, you know, obviously not at the grant's expense, but you're there with family and friends, people that you work with. Outside of that, I mean, if you have a healthy social life and a healthy outside life, that's going to make it better. So all these things are important for career, to moving society forward. You keep balance.
Well, I know it was your pleasure to be a part of the Oral History Criminology project, but it was certainly my pleasure to be involved to interview you.
Thank you, son. I appreciate it. Love you.